What if the simplest tool in your home, a tape measure, became the only witness to a perfect murder? A sleepy English village, a respected woman, found dead in her own parlor, and a single, impossible clue everyone overlooked. In the next 90 minutes, you'll unravel a web of lies, betrayals, and hidden sins, where every chapter reveals a darker truth. But be warned, by the time you reach the end, you'll never look at your neighbors the same way again. So hit subscribe now and stay until the final chapter, because the real killer is not who you think. Chapter 1: The Victim and the Village. And so, my friends, we arrive in the village of Much Woodham, a place as quaint as any painter's dream, a scattering of rose-draped cottages, a modest church with a clock that never chimes quite on time, and hedgerows so neatly trimmed one might believe they had been combed each morning. Nothing here gave the impression that life could be anything but polite conversations, the clink of teacups, and the rustle of the Morning Post. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. Mrs. Lavinia Spenlow was known by all, respected by many, liked by some, and envied by more than she might have guessed. She hosted afternoon teas in her drawing-room, boasting a reputation for punctuality so severe she was said to set her clocks 10 minutes fast, just to avoid the faintest whiff of tardiness. But on that Wednesday morning, the milkman's knock went unanswered, her curtains remained stubbornly closed, and by mid-morning, whispers began to flow like a low stream through the village lanes. The local constable arrived at her cottage to find the sitting-room in impeccable order. A delicate china cup rested precisely upon its saucer, a lace doily set unwrinkled on the sideboard, and sunlight filtered through sheer curtains with innocent softness. Yet there, sprawled beside her writing desk, lay Mrs. Spenlow herself, her face pale, eyes wide as if in astonishment. By her side, resting in a peculiar position across the carpet, was a yellow tape measure, fully extended, numbers gleaming faintly in the dappled light, its end hooked near the leg of the heavy desk as though measuring something that never needed to be measured. Word spread with alarming efficiency, carried in hushed exchanges between housemaids on errands, murmured in the low aisles of the greengrocer, and passed with somber nods across the pews of St. Bartholomew's. There was Mrs. Hardcastle, who insisted she had seen a tall figure slip past the Spenlow gate at 9:30, and old Mr. Trevelyan, who, from his window above the butcher's, claimed he caught a glint of light from Mrs. Spenlow's parlor at a time when no lamp should have been lit. What puzzled everyone most, however, was the complete absence of disturbance. Nothing broken, nothing missing, no sign of a scuffle. It was as if the very air had stilled itself out of respect. The only thing out of place was that odd tape measure, its bright numerals a silent testament to an event that defied the village's understanding of how the world ought to work. It did not take long for Miss Jane Marple to appear in Much Woodham, arriving in her modest black car that coughed politely before falling silent by the gate of the Spenlow cottage. She stepped out with the grace of one accustomed to both the finer points of etiquette and the hidden truths of human nature. Her eyes moved slowly across the garden, lingering upon the line of crushed grass beside the pathway, the faint scuff upon the threshold, and the milk bottles still sweating under the noon sun. Inside, Miss Marple surveyed the parlor with a detachment that belied her years of listening more carefully than most ever realized. She noted the angle of the overturned chair leg, which pointed almost accusingly toward the writing desk, the neat pile of correspondence that, upon closer inspection, revealed one envelope slit open not with Mrs. Spenlow's usual precision, but jaggedly, as though by a hand unaccustomed to restraint. Voices filtered through the open window, drifting in from the gathering cluster of villagers outside. Mrs. Craythorne's brittle whisper insisting Mrs. Spenlow had enemies. Young Peter Draycott's uncertain confession that he had been delivering a telegram that morning, though he hesitated to admit precisely when. Their words, seemingly harmless, carried a weight that settled into Miss Marple's keen mind, each statement another thread to weave into the tapestry of the morning's events. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the tape measure once more, bending carefully to trace its length with a gloved finger, She paused where it passed beneath the heavy mahogany desk, then lifted her eyes to the clock upon the mantel, its hands frozen at 9:47, a time no one in the village could agree upon. Some swore they had seen Mrs. Spenlow alive well after 10. Others insisted the house had been silent from shortly after breakfast. Outside, the villagers exchanged glances in the way of those who believe nothing truly shocking can happen in their midst, even as their eyes flicked with wary curiosity toward the curtained windows. Questions whispered through the air. Who had reason to slip into that cottage unnoticed? What message had arrived in that torn letter? And why would anyone take the trouble to leave a measuring tape lying so conspicuously upon the floor? Unless, of course, it was intended to be found. By mid-afternoon, the village had taken on the hush of an audience, waiting for the next act. Doors stood slightly ajar, curtains barely shifted as watchful eyes followed the comings and goings of the constable, the vicar, and finally Dr. Clement, who arrived with a medical bag in one hand and a puzzled frown upon his face. His conclusion, offered with more caution than certainty, suggested Mrs. Spenlow's heart had simply given out. Yet to those who knew her, the idea of that formidable woman succumbing without protest felt unconvincing. Miss Marple listened politely, her delicate hands folded upon the handle of her handbag, her mind turning over each inconsistency with the patience of one accustomed to waiting for truth to slip through the smallest of cracks. She observed the good doctor's lingering glance at the letter upon the writing desk, the way his voice caught slightly as he described the position of the body, and the way his eyes flicked toward the tape measure, just for a moment, as if it disturbed him more than he wished to admit. Outside, the murmurs grew into theories. Mrs. Hardcastle suggested the matter was surely the result of a family quarrel reaching its quiet conclusion. Mr. Trevelyan argued it was the work of an outsider, someone who had drifted into Much Woodham unseen. But beneath these stories lay a trembling uncertainty, for the villagers knew in the small hours of the night every squeak of the floorboards, every rustle of the hedges carried new meaning when a sense of safety was replaced by the cold certainty of unanswered questions. Miss Marple moved through the hallway of the Spenlow cottage, pausing at the hall stand where Mrs. Spenlow's hat and gloves still waited, perfectly aligned. She studied the scuff marks on the wooden floor, the faint scent of lavender polish masking something sharp beneath it, and the faint impression of a man's shoe upon the carpet near the door. At the threshold, she paused, letting her eyes rest upon the gathered villagers beyond the gate. They stood together, yet there was a subtle distance in their stances, a wary shifting of weight from foot to foot, as if each wondered whether a neighbor's familiar face might conceal secrets too unsettling to consider. A quiet thought passed across Miss Marple's expression, brief but unmistakable, as she glanced once more at the unmoving clock on the mantel. The time it declared, 9:47, did not match the stories whispered by those who claimed to know exactly when Mrs. Spenlow had last been seen. Nothing seemed out of place until it suddenly was, and in that moment Miss Marple understood one truth with the clarity of a bell tolling at midnight. The timeline the village so confidently repeated could not possibly be correct. And so the question took shape in the still afternoon air, as persistent and unyielding as the ticking of a clock no one could hear. If the hour everyone accepted was a lie, what else had been carefully arranged to keep the truth just beyond reach? If you find yourself as intrigued by the mystery unfolding here as I am, I invite you to subscribe. Together, we shall uncover each hidden piece until the final revelation awaits. Chapter 2: Suspects Emerge. From the very moment Miss Marple recognized the hour the village, so confidently recited, could not have been true, a quiet shift settled over Much Woodham, like a church bell tolling softly in the distance, heard by those who had something to hide. There were faces in the small crowd gathered along the Spenlow gate who seemed too eager to share their stories, and others who kept their eyes fixed upon the ground, speaking only when prompted, their words chosen with the care of one placing porcelain on stone. It was during this hushed afternoon that Miss Marple began to look beyond the facts everyone repeated, and instead to the subtle notes of discomfort and contradiction in the voices of three particular villagers. The first was Miss Ellen Trowbridge, the village dressmaker, a woman with quick fingers and a quicker tongue. She was known to recite every measurement of every waist and hemline in Much Woodham. Yet on that morning, when asked about the time she had last seen Mrs. Spenlow, her voice faltered. Her gaze dropped to the threadbare carpet of the constable's office, and a faint tremor passed across her hands. As she spoke, flashes of memory surfaced. The day before, Mrs. Spenlow had scolded Miss Trowbridge for the looseness of a sleeve, a matter of public embarrassment in the greengrocer's shop. A quarrel followed, voices sharp enough to reach the street, ending with Mrs. Spenlow's parting words echoing like a gavel. "I will have nothing more to do with your sloppy work, Miss Trowbridge." These words had clung to the dressmaker's mind, even as she hurried home clutching her sewing bag, glancing over her shoulder more than once. Between interviews, Miss Marple's mind unfolded these recollections, layering each phrase upon the timeline that now lay in tatters. She pondered the odd detail of the measuring tape at the scene. For Miss Trowbridge, above all others, lived her days to the whisper of shifting cloth, the snap of scissors, and the soft coil of tape. But Miss Marple, ever cautious, knew proximity to an object did not equate to guilt. Still, it was a connection that could not be dismissed. The second face that drew Miss Marple's quiet attention belonged to Mr. Percival Greenlaw, who lived 2 cottages down from Mrs. Spenlow, separated only by a tangle of hedges and a narrow lane. He had inherited his father's small holding years before, yet spoke often of missed opportunities, of grievances never addressed, of ways in which life, or certain neighbors, had failed to offer him the respect he believed he deserved. Though Mr. Greenlaw's words at the village meeting rang with the indignation of one certain of his own righteousness, his eyes betrayed a deeper current. When he described his recollection of the morning's events, he painted a picture almost too detailed, recounting the milkman's arrival, the passing of the postman, the striking of the church clock, all with the precision of one rehearsing a script. Yet Miss Marple caught the inconsistency. He mentioned the church clock chiming at a time it could not have, for the old bell tower had been silent these past 3 days while repairs were made. This single misstep, uttered so smoothly yet so impossibly, slipped into Miss Marple's mental ledger as naturally as a leaf falling to earth. A brief memory flickered behind Mr. Greenlaw's stony gaze, a meeting in Mrs. Spenlow's garden only a week before. Voices rising as she accused him of trespassing to prune a section of hedge she insisted was hers. Witnesses recalled hearing sharp words exchanged about boundaries, rights, and never stepping foot upon my path again. In the hush of Much Woodham's narrow lanes, such conflicts took on lives of their own. The feud had become a subject of quiet speculation at the baker's counter, a matter of polite concern during church tea, and now, under the gaze of Miss Marple, an urgent line of inquiry. The third figure who captured Miss Marple's unwavering curiosity was Mr. Arthur Spenlow, the late Mrs. Spenlow's husband. He was a man of few words, his voice carrying the low, gravelly timbre of someone accustomed to silence. His eyes, dark and steady, seemed always to search the faces around him for unspoken intentions. Though he professed grief with the dignity expected of a husband, there were corners of his expression where shadows lingered, and a careful listener might have caught the edge of impatience in his tone when asked to recount his whereabouts. Arthur claimed to have been in the neighboring town on the morning in question, arranging the delivery of a new gate for the garden. Yet no one in Much Woodham recalled seeing him leave, and the carter responsible for deliveries stated he had waited at the appointed place far longer than any appointment required, eventually departing without having met Mr. Spenlow at all. Memories surfaced of their recent disagreements. Mrs. Spenlow had threatened to cut him off from the modest inheritance she had inherited from an aunt, an inheritance she guarded with vigilance. Their arguments, overheard by Mrs. Hardcastle from her own porch, rang with a cold, clipped fury Miss Marple heard in these retellings of marriage that had long since shifted from mutual comfort to a careful balance of resentment, each waiting for the other to slip. As Miss Marple stood before the small writing desk in the parlor, her eyes swept across its surface once more, where the torn letter still rested, a letter that, until now, no one had thought to read. She reached for it with a gloved hand, unfolded the heavy paper, and scanned the lines written in Mrs. Spenlow's spidery hand. At the bottom of the page, words leapt forth with quiet menace. I can no longer abide what I have discovered. It must be known before it is too late. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for tucked beneath the final sheet, folded so small it might have gone unseen forever, lay another note, penned in haste and bearing only the words, "You must stop or all will be revealed." And so the question deepened, drawing the villagers of Much Woodham further into a mystery that no one could yet name, yet each feared more with every passing hour. Who do you think looks most suspicious so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us see who among us can untangle this web before the truth emerges. Chapter 3: The Timeline Crumbles. Even as the final echoes of the village clock faded on that uneasy afternoon, Miss Marple stood by the narrow writing desk, the torn letter still trembling slightly in her gloved hand. A hush settled over Much Woodham's lanes, and within that silence rose a new urgency, a question too pressing to ignore. If each suspect's words carried a seed of contradiction, what did that say about the hour when everything changed? For it is time itself, mon ami, that so often tells the tale. A minute too soon, a minute too late. In such moments entire alibis unravel, and intentions reveal themselves. Miss Marple withdrew to the vicarage's study, where maps of Much Woodham streets, hand-drawn by the curate in happier days, lay unfurled across a heavy oak table. She laid out the suspect's statements, the constable's official timeline, and the few facts beyond dispute. The milkman's arrival at 8:47, the postman's knock at 9:20, and the church clock silence on that very morning when it should have chimed at 9:30. She noted how Miss Trowbridge insisted she heard Mrs. Spenlow's voice calling to someone at precisely 9:15, a time placing her in the home even as others swore she was not seen. Mr. Greenlaw claimed to have been in his garden until 9:45, describing details of the lane with a confidence bordering on arrogance, yet forgetting entirely that his own neighbor had seen him slip into the alley at a time no one else would have noticed. And Mr. Spenlow's story of an errand to the next village fell apart when Miss Marple confirmed, with a single telegram, that the gate delivery had been cancelled the day before, leaving no reason at all for his claimed absence. Each contradiction was like a crack across a porcelain plate, small on its own, yet spreading into a network of fissures that could not be mended. Miss Marple began to mark these moments upon the map, small pins pricking the paper where alibis began to falter, red threads connecting times and places that could never coexist if even one word of truth remained. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as the evidence gathered, a pattern emerged. The timeline shared so eagerly by the villagers formed a perfect loop of agreement, each witness supporting the next with details that fit too conveniently, as if someone had guided their words, shaping their memories to a single false hour. Miss Marple sat back, hands folded neatly upon the vicar's polished table, eyes narrowed as she surveyed the rows of notes and statements before her. Each line was a declaration of certainty from a villager convinced they remembered the morning with perfect clarity. Yet the more she read, the more their words tangled like ivy upon the crumbling stones of an old wall. She re-examined the milkman's delivery slip, the one the constable held so dearly as his first fixed point in time, and noticed a curious detail. The slip was signed in a hand far neater than the milkman's own, as if someone else had taken the pencil to it. Could it be that even the morning's earliest record had been tampered with, bent gently to support the illusion of a timeline no one could confirm? Outside, the day had begun to fade, long shadows stretching across the village green. Villagers spoke with low voices as they carried parcels home, heads bowed in thought. Rumors now shifted like a breeze from cottage to cottage. Some whispered of the dressmaker's sudden debts. others wondered aloud about Mr. Greenlaw's quiet meetings with strangers at the edge of the village. A few remembered old Mr. Spenlow's brief absence from the village years ago, a disappearance explained by work, yet never fully accepted by those who thrived on the stories of others. Miss Marple listened to each retelling with polite patience, letting every rumor spin its thread before gently pulling at it to see what frayed. She arranged the statements upon her table in careful order, one suspect's recollection placing them at the market, while another placed them on the road, both claims impossible if the other was true. Each fresh contradiction was pinned to the growing web of lines upon her maps, the paper now crowded with arrows, times, and names, a portrait of a village bound by politeness but rattled by fear. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as she moved to a note she had overlooked before, a receipt found in Mrs. Spenlow's wastebasket, dated for a delivery she never received, Miss Marple felt the first true crack of the entire timeline split open beneath her careful hands. With the village's tangled timeline now lying before her like an open wound, Miss Marple pressed further still, her mind unspooling each contradiction with relentless precision. She found herself drawn back to the unexplained receipt, which bore a signature not belonging to Mrs. Spenlow nor any of the three familiar suspects. The handwriting slanted with an elegant flourish, one practiced yet hurried, hinting at both education and anxiety. Miss Marple retrieved her spectacles and compared the letters to known samples. Miss Trowbridge's neat loops, Mr. Greenlaw's heavy strokes, Mr. Spenlow's abrupt jabs. None matched the graceful script that adorned the receipt. Who, then, had been close enough to enter the Spenlow home undetected, confident enough to sign on her behalf, and careful enough to leave so few traces? Questions rose like mist upon the village lanes, curling through the hedgerows and rattling the certainty of every whispered theory. And so, the timeline that had already collapsed under the weight of conflicting alibis gave way completely as Miss Marple uncovered a name no one had dared speak. Clara Denholm, Mrs. Spenlow's former companion, dismissed from service months earlier under a veil of secrecy and bitterness. Few in Much Woodham remembered Clara, fewer still knew where she had gone. But here, in the stroke of a pen upon an unremarkable receipt, her presence returned like an echo from a locked room. Miss Marple's breath caught for the briefest moment, her eyes narrowing as she set the paper down with the care of someone placing a delicate relic upon an altar. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for with Clara's name, the map of the village shifted once more, revealing a hidden corridor of motive and opportunity that could no longer be ignored. And so the heart of the mystery deepened, the hour of truth slipping further from the villagers' reach even as Miss Marple felt it draw near in the stillness of the evening air. If this unraveling timeline has you reconsidering every alibi, I invite you to subscribe so you may follow each revelation as we draw ever closer to the final truth together. Chapter 4: Dark Secrets Unearthed. And so Clara Denholm's name drifted through the village like a chill upon the evening breeze, reaching ears eager for distraction, yet unprepared for the implications it carried. Miss Marple sat quietly by the vicarage hearth that night, the glow of a single lamp casting shifting shadows across her face as she turned over each detail. For in Much Woodham, secrets are not lost, only misplaced, waiting for the right moment to rise again, unbidden, to the surface of polite conversation. Whispers of Clara's dismissal months earlier returned with the clarity of old church bells. Villagers recalled Mrs. Spenlow's sudden decision, citing vague concerns about honesty and propriety. Yet, as Miss Marple listened to these half-remembered stories, she noted the unease that crept into voices otherwise eager to gossip. Each tale carried a hesitation, as if the tellers feared what might be uncovered should the truth be pursued too closely. From the shadows of Clara's reappearance emerged hints of other entanglements long buried beneath the village's tranquil facade. Mr. Greenlaw, the resentful neighbor, was rumored to have entered into a quiet arrangement with Clara before her dismissal, a connection spoken of only in hushed tones after Sunday services. There were murmurs of whispered meetings in the garden behind the old schoolhouse, where promises may have been exchanged in the night, each carrying consequences neither fully understood. Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Hardcastle, so often first with tidings of others' affairs, avoided this subject entirely, her eyes darting away whenever Clara's name passed another's lips. It was the kind of avoidance that spoke louder than any accusation, a silence too intentional to be dismissed. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as Miss Marple traced these rumors to their source, a pattern formed more twisted than even she had dared expect. She began to hear talk of debts quietly amassed by the dressmaker Miss Trowbridge, debts owed to names outside Much Woodham, men and women who demanded repayment without patience or pity. Letters requesting extensions had vanished from her post, never arriving at their destinations, and though Miss Trowbridge insisted she had misplaced them herself, Miss Marple found it difficult to believe in so many accidents occurring at precisely the worst moments. Miss Marple's inquiries moved quietly through the village, carried by polite conversations in the greengrocer's, unassuming chats outside the post office, and brief nods exchanged across the pews of St. Bartholomew's. What emerged was a portrait of Much Woodham more complex than any outsider could have imagined. A place where favors were granted with smiles but repaid with whispers, where old grievances found new life in moments of weakness. She uncovered the story of a loan Mrs. Spenlow had once extended to Mr. Spenlow's distant cousin, a matter of a modest sum at the time, but grown into a festering wound when repayment never arrived. What troubled Miss Marple more was that Mrs. Spenlow had begun to speak of calling in the debt only days before her sudden silence, a threat that, in a village of such narrow margins, could ruin reputations and upend carefully curated lives. Meanwhile, a dramatic reenactment unfolded in Miss Marple's mind as she pieced together Clara's final weeks in the Spenlow household. Late-night arguments behind the heavy drapes of the parlor, hurried steps heard along the back corridor when all others had retired, a single lamp seen burning long past midnight by Mrs. Hardcastle, who watched the Spenlow cottage from her window with unwavering devotion to other people's business. Miss Marple imagined Clara's voice, edged with desperation, rising to match Mrs. Spenlow's cold firmness. She pictured the glint of anger in Clara's eyes, the tension that settled in her shoulders, the way her hands might have clenched the edge of her apron as words were exchanged that could not be taken back. Each new recollection, each hushed retelling, layered weight upon the mystery, and all the while the villagers continued their days with forced cheer, their laughter thinner, eyes shifting when questions turned too near the truth. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as dusk gathered over the village rooftops, stories began to twist upon themselves, each retelling revealing contradictions so subtle only a mind as patient as Miss Marple's could tease them apart. And among these tangled stories lay hints of a final, unspoken motive yet to be named. As the village settled into uneasy sleep that night, lamplight flickered in the small window of Miss Marple's guest room at the vicarage, where she sat once more before her map of Much Woodham. The delicate threads connecting each villager's words grew taut, stretching across timelines and motives until they hummed with the promise of revelation. Yet just as clarity approached, fresh confusion arrived unbidden. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who came breathless to Miss Marple's door, a scrap of charred paper clutched between her fingers. She spoke of passing the Spenlow cottage's side alley on her return from evening prayers, of catching the faint scent of burning drifting through the hedges. She glimpsed a figure retreating into darkness, the glow of a match briefly lighting a face she could not place. The paper she found still smoldering upon the stones bore traces of inked words that crackled away before they could be read. Yet a single phrase clung stubbornly to the burnt edge. She must never. Miss Marple read those words in silence, the room around her seeming to hold its breath. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for the discovery of a desperate attempt to destroy evidence revealed a mind fraying under pressure, a hand growing careless even as it tried to erase the past. Moments later, a soft rustle at the window drew her attention. There, pressed against the glass, lay an envelope without address or seal. Inside, upon rough paper in a hurried script, were words both chilling and unmistakable. "Stop asking questions, or you will wish you hadn't." Miss Marple folded the note carefully, her eyes narrowing as she placed it alongside the scraps of charred paper. The game had changed. The shadows of Much Woodham had grown longer, and the polite masks worn by its people thinner than ever before. Yet in that moment of quiet resolve, Miss Marple knew this mystery had only begun to bare its teeth. If this twist shocked you, hit the like button so more mystery lovers may join us in uncovering the secrets of Much Woodham. Chapter 5. The False Accusation. The morning after Miss Marple's discovery of the anonymous threat dawned gray and tense, with clouds low enough to press against the gables of Much Woodham's cottages. A hush settled over the village green, broken only by the muffled clip of constables, boots upon cobbles, as they gathered near the Spenlow cottage, their presence a dark omen beneath the reluctant light of day. Word travelled quickly, as it always does in places where nothing should happen, but often does. And with each retelling, the story grew until every heart beat a little faster. At precisely 7:30, Constable Barnes stepped forward with hesitant authority, his eyes darting toward the growing crowd as he called out a name none expected to hear: Miss Ellen Trowbridge. Gasps fluttered among the villagers, a chorus of disbelief, followed by a hush so deep even the birds seemed to still their songs. She stood by her garden gate, the morning's mist curling about her skirts, eyes wide with the look of one seeing a nightmare slip from shadow to daylight. Barnes presented a folded scrap of paper, lifted from the ashes discovered in the Spenlow alley, bearing Miss Trowbridge's initials scrawled in faded ink, a discovery declared damning enough to draw suspicion's full weight upon her slender shoulders. Her protests fell like pebbles into an endless well, swallowed by silence and the murmurs rippling through the gathered onlookers. From the edge of the crowd, Miss Marple watched with a stillness deeper than the hush around her. Her eyes moved from the evidence in Barnes's shaking hands to the pale face of the dressmaker, reading the fear that rose with each word spoken against her. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for the look of surprise upon Miss Trowbridge's face was not the startled expression of one cornered by truth, but rather the stunned horror of someone caught in a trap they never saw laid. The villagers pressed closer, the circle around Miss Trowbridge tightening as whispers raced from mouth to ear. Mrs. Hardcastle clutched her shawl as though it might shield her from the rising dread, while Mr. Greenlaw shifted his weight from foot to foot, eyes flicking nervously between the constables and the accused. In the hush, every cough, every gasp, every rustle of skirts carried the weight of accusation. Constable Barnes cleared his throat and read aloud the lines of the charred note. A warning, yes, but written in a hand they now insisted belonged to Miss Trowbridge. A single constable placed a tentative hand upon her arm, guiding her gently yet firmly toward the waiting carriage. The air thrummed with the mix of satisfaction and unease that follows when certainty appears to settle over a restless crowd. Yet even as villagers nodded to one another, relief glinting in their eyes, a sliver of discomfort pulsed beneath the surface. From her vantage at the edge of the gathering, Miss Marple studied the faces turned toward Miss Trowbridge. She noted how Clara Denholm's name, spoken only yesterday, had already been forgotten in the rush to blame. How Mr. Spenlow, standing with arms folded, watched the proceedings with an expression too blank to trust, and how Mr. Greenlaw, who only days before had been the subject of quiet suspicion himself, now looked upon the dressmaker with a peculiar blend of pity and hidden satisfaction. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as the carriage doors closed with a soft click, Miss Marple realized that every piece of evidence had appeared far too conveniently, the puzzle snapping into place almost as if someone had guided each discovery. And in that artificial neatness, she found the seed of her deepest doubt yet. As the carriage bearing Miss Trowbridge rolled away, the clatter of its wheels fading into the hush of the village lanes, Much Woodham exhaled a breath it had not realized it was holding. Conversations broke out in clusters along the green. Words of relief, mutterings of uncertainty, and occasional bursts of satisfaction from those too eager to believe the matter settled. Yet, at the vicarage window, Miss Marple watched the shifting crowd with an expression that revealed nothing, though her mind turned like the gears of an old clock, each thought clicking into place with deliberate care. She spread her notes upon the polished table, arranging statements beside receipts, times beside memories, each page marked with the delicate pencil lines that mapped truths no one else had noticed. She traced the moments when the timeline had shifted imperceptibly, the curious way the village's collective memory bent in unison, and the sudden reappearance of Clara Denholm's name only to vanish beneath the fervor of a convenient arrest. A knock sounded at the vicarage door, hesitant, barely more than the whisper of knuckles against wood, and Miss Marple opened it to find young Peter Draycott, cap in hand, eyes wide with the knowledge of something he was no longer certain he should share. He spoke of seeing Mr. Spenlow near the Spenlow cottage not after. But before the hour he claimed to have left for his errands, moving with hurried steps and casting glances over his shoulder as though measuring the silence itself. Miss Marple thanked Peter with a kind word and a gentle nod, then closed the door softly behind him. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in that small confession, shared by a boy too young to understand the weight of his words, lay a truth that had eluded every careful plan. The timeline's collapse was no accident, but the result of careful hands arranging events like pieces upon a chessboard. Chapter 6. The Trap is Set. The weight of Peter Draycott's timid words lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after the boy had scurried home through the mist-laden streets. That a child's eyes had glimpsed what the village's careful lies sought to hide gave her both a clue and a key, a way to unlock the tangled threads of time and motive that held Much Woodham fast in their quiet snare. In the small hours before dawn, Miss Marple moved through the vicarage study, her silhouette framed by lamplight as she gathered her notes and marked them with delicate pencil lines. The names of each suspect stood written in a precise hand across the edges of her map. Clara Denholm, returned from shadows. Miss Trowbridge, cast wrongly into disgrace. Mr. Greenlaw, harboring resentments sharp enough to cut. And Mr. Spenlow himself, whose presence near the cottage at an hour he denied could no longer be ignored. She planned with the care of one arranging a delicate clockwork, an invitation, issued in the name of the vicar, to all those whose alibis lay in tatters and whose motives, spoken or unspoken, had drifted into the open air. Each was called to gather at Mrs. Spenlow's cottage, under the polite pretext of clarifying the final affairs of the late matron, a summons none dared refuse, for to decline would have cast a longer shadow than attendance could ever manage. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as Miss Marple penned the final note and tucked it into its envelope, she felt the familiar thrill of a mind reaching the edge of revelation. She knew that in drawing each suspect back into the room where secrets had first been scattered like seeds, she would give the truth one last chance to slip free of the carefully woven veil draped across the village's conscience. By the appointed hour, the parlor of the Spenlow cottage held a charged silence more profound than any sermon. The polished floorboards creaked beneath cautious footsteps as each suspect entered in turn, eyes darting from shadowed corners to familiar faces. Miss Trowbridge, recently freed but still pale from the ordeal, took a seat near the hearth. Mr. Greenlaw settled himself stiffly by the window, fingers tapping his knee in restless rhythm. Clara Denholm hovered near the door, gaze low yet darting up at each movement, and at last Mr. Spenlow arrived, hat in hand, eyes fixed upon the space once occupied by his late wife's favorite chair. Miss Marple's voice, gentle yet unyielding, broke the stillness. She laid out the timeline once more, tracing each moment with a pointer across a clock face drawn upon the table. As she recited the movements of the milkman, the postman, the neighbors who swore to a chorus of details now proven false, the air thickened with the awareness that the perfect sequence of alibis they had clung to could not bear the weight of truth. Every so often, her words paused, allowing silence to settle upon the gathered group like dust upon old letters. In those silences, eyes shifted, breaths caught, and the faint drumming of a heartbeat seemed to echo in the still room. Or perhaps it was many hearts, pounding together in time with the rising certainty that one among them had guided every lie. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft yet cutting as she highlighted the discrepancies in Mr. Greenlaw's morning, the unaccounted moments in Mr. Spenlow's absence, the letters that never arrived, and the quiet disappearance of Clara herself from the village's memory. She watched the subtle flinches of their expressions, the twitch of a mouth, the tightening of a hand around a teacup handle, each one a note in a symphony of unspoken confessions. As the minutes ticked by in the dimly lit parlor, the pressure of so many secrets held in a single room grew almost audible. Miss Marple's questions shifted from polite to precise. Her eyes settled upon each guest in turn, allowing a pause long enough to invite honesty, yet short enough to spark fear in those who had none to offer. Suddenly, Clara Denholm's voice cracked the silence, her words spilling forth in a breathless rush as she admitted to arguments with Mrs. Spenlow over matters of pride and money, words that grew heated and careless in the confines of that very room. Her face blanched as she spoke, tears gathering upon lashes that fluttered like moths near flame. But just as she began to stumble into the deeper truth, Mr. Spenlow's voice cut through hers, low and steady, each syllable chosen with unsettling precision as he urged her to stop speaking of matters best left in the past. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for in that moment Miss Marple glimpsed it, the flicker of triumph in Mr. Spenlow's eyes as Clara fell silent, the faint curve at the corner of his mouth betraying the satisfaction of one who believed the final piece had clicked quietly into place. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver as she stood, folding her hands before her and stepping into the thin shaft of light spilling across the parlor floor. Her voice fell to a soft murmur as she invited Mr. Spenlow to remain behind when the others departed, her words tinged with a calm finality that left no room for refusal. The others filed out with hushed murmurs and backward glances, the door closing upon the parlor with a muted click that seemed to echo into the heart of the village itself. If you think you know who holds the final secret, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the final reveal awaiting in our last chapter. Chapter 7: The Killer Unmasked. The parlor door clicked shut with a softness that belied the finality it carried. Outside, the muted voices of the departing guests drifted into the quiet night, leaving Miss Marple alone with Mr. Spenlow in the dim glow of a single lamp. The two stood facing one another across the rug where Mrs. Spenlow had once held court, the silence so deep it seemed to press upon the walls themselves. Miss Marple's eyes, clear and unflinching, held Mr. Spenlow's gaze as she began to speak, her voice low, each word falling into the room like pebbles into a still pond. She reminded him of the morning milk delivery, the time the slip was signed in a hand too elegant for the milkman's own. She recounted Peter Draycott's quiet confession of having seen Mr. Spenlow at the gate long before he claimed to have left. She laid out the false trail of torn letters and charred notes planted to guide suspicion toward an innocent dressmaker, each step orchestrated with a precision born not of panic, but of calm calculation. As her words moved through the events of that morning, they knit the hours into a pattern as intricate as lace, revealing how each moment so confidently recounted by the villagers had been gently nudged, shaped until it fit a story none dared to question. She recited the moments Mrs. Spenlow's voice was heard by Miss Trowbridge, the impossibility of the church clock chiming when its bell stood silent, and the convenient reappearance of Clara Denholm's name to distract every wary eye. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for now. In the quiet space between Miss Marple's careful sentences, the perfect tapestry of the timeline fell apart, each thread fraying to reveal the truth beneath. Miss Marple's words shifted from observation to accusation with the gentlest of transitions. Her tone as polite as afternoon tea, yet sharp enough to cut through every lie laid before her. She turned first to the memory of Miss Trowbridge, whose debts and arguments made her an easy target, yet whose alibi, when examined closely, held fast to the unyielding truth of her innocence. She recounted how Miss Trowbridge's path through the village matched the milkman's account exactly, confirmed by 3 others with no reason to protect her. Next, she spoke of Clara Denholm, whose return had startled the village and whose conflicts with Mrs. Spenlow burned hot enough to leave scars. But Miss Marple revealed Clara's desperate letters, pleading for help rather than plotting harm, letters that never reached their destination because someone else had intercepted them before they could alter the course of suspicion. She fixed Mr. Greenlaw with a measured gaze as she recounted his shifting stories, each time matching the village's rumors but never the facts. Yet even his resentments, as bitter as they were, lacked the quiet cunning required to orchestrate a plan so seamless it fooled every watchful eye. His lies, she concluded, were those of a man afraid to be blamed, not one guiding blame from the shadows. Each elimination left only the hush of ticking time, the steady patter of rain against the cottage windows, and Mr. Spenlow's increasingly rigid posture as he realized the web of certainty unraveling around him. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for with every fact laid bare, only he remained bound to every inconsistency, every contradiction, every moment when the truth bent to suit a careful narrative. Miss Marple stepped closer to Mr. Spenlow, her eyes calm and unblinking as the final moments of her careful tale fell into place. She described how he alone possessed the opportunity to move through the house unnoticed, how his knowledge of his wife's habits allowed him to arrange the parlor scene so convincingly that even the most discerning gaze would find nothing amiss. She laid bare the false slip signed with elegant script, the charred notes that appeared too readily, the rumors seeded through the village just when suspicion began to drift elsewhere. She spoke softly of the tape measure, an object so innocuous, yet chosen precisely because it belonged to the dressmaker, allowing every eye to follow a trail away from the truth. She described the subtle shifts in the village timeline, nudged minute by minute until each witness's certainty served his design. And she reminded him that only he stood to lose everything should Mrs. Spenlow's intentions to cut him off become known, a motive so quiet and powerful it needed no raised voice or open conflict to set his plan in motion. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was, for as her final words fell into the hushed parlor, Mr. Spenlow's mask cracked at last. His shoulders slumped, eyes clouded with a dull, desperate resignation, and the silence stretched longer than any ticking clock could measure. Miss Marple folded her hands gently, voice softening with the weight of what had passed. "You see, monsieur," she murmured, "the truth may slumber, but it never truly dies." She turned to the empty parlor, her eyes tracing the walls that had witnessed every whispered secret of Much Woodham, knowing this story, like so many before, would ripple through its quiet streets for years to come. Thank you for joining this complete 7-chapter breakdown of Miss Marple's most chilling case. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, hit like and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive. And let us know in the comments which twist shocked you the most, or which Christie mystery you'd like us to break down next. Until then, keep your eyes open and your tape measures close.